Welcome to another blistering edition of FME Attention Undivided, where we go in depth with some of the world's most interesting people. And this edition has been a dream of mine for a while. And we'll get into it. This is my favorite poet in the world, Adrian Matejka.
So I don't want to interrupt you, but it's pronounced Matejka, so we might want to start over.
Matejka. That's okay. Adrian Matejka.
Yeah.
I'm terrible at pronouncing things, as you will come to understand.
No, it's good. I want to make sure that you looked as awesome as you are.
But thank you. You are the first Pulitzer-nominated guest that I've had. First National Book Award-nominated guest. So I am deeply grateful for you being here. You just released a new book, Somebody Else Sold the World. Get that. So there's a lot of tourists coming through Maine. I was in a bookstore and there was like a quiet teenager that was in that kind of standing up but balled up, like, don't talk to me, I'm very nervous. And I just was in the poetry section and I pointed to two books and I said, those are the ones. And it was Ada Limon The Carrying and Somebody Else Sold the World. So
oh man, that's good company.
Yeah. So it was.
No, go ahead.
No, how's the reception been since this came out?
I don't know, man. I mean, I've kind of felt like that teenager you were describing, a little balled up, a little hunched over, trying to come back out into the world, blinking in the light,
Mm-hmm.
I was kicking it with one of my friends the other day and, we're both vaccinated and I haven't seen him in a long time. So we didn't have our masks on. And I kept catching myself looking at his chin because I hadn't seen anybody else's chin except for my wife's in a couple of years. And so trying to go out in the world and carry these poems, it feels like it's been a very different experience. And I've done a couple of in-person readings, but mostly Zoom. And so people seem to be responding to it, but everything's still a little bit fresh, you know what I mean? To be writing about the pandemic, even through the lens of music, while it's still going on is kind of complicated.
Yeah, no, it's, and I have to give a little backstory here. What is Bodhi? So I first learned about you in 2017 because of a gentleman named Gibson Fay LeBlanc.
He's a poet, right?
He's a poet.
Yeah, I've read his stuff. I was trying to remember if I'd ever met him. I don't know if I have, but I've met his poems on the page.
Loves hockey. And so he's, so basically my wife, I took college after, like way after. Like I went to the military, came back from the military, and I did classes here and there, but I was coming up on the deadline where I couldn't use the GI Bill anymore. So I was like and my wife was organizing my credits and she was like, and so USM doesn't have a creative writing major. So I was like, this sucks. I'm gonna right? So I got a minor. It was cool. But she's like, you've got one class left you've got to do to get this minor, and it's poetry. I was like, shit. Because I used to run a poetry, I used to help run. I was like the assistant coach keeping people in line, but like of Port Veritas, which is a spoken word poetry organization in Portland, Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And it was dramatic and it was intense and there were so many feelings and young people, and like it really helped me and stuff, but it was a lot to deal with.
Yeah, sure.
And so by the time I got out of that, I was like, I want some time to relax here. I don't want someone telling me what poetry is again.
Yeah.
But Gibson Fay LeBlanc did not do the whole like, here's Keats, here's Yeats. Like he didn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
He handed us several books, a Stephen Burt book, which a bunch of cool stuff, and like International Book of Poetry. with a Polish section and a Russian section and a Japanese section. And he was hitting it hard. And so there was an intense syllabus there. We had Ocean Vuong, Terrence Hayes, Claudia Rankine, Ross Gay. These are all like Maine white kids who don't know about any of this stuff. So it was intense for them. And I was, I'm a nerd at my core, right? And so as nerdy as Gibson Faye LeBlanc was, I was like, I felt challenged. I was like, I can't be out nerded in this game.
That's right. Right. You to stand up,
So you weren't on the syllabus, but I found you through my nerdy hunting. There's a great story of the women in my class becoming universally attracted to Terrence Hayes from the book, from the picture on the back of.
Yes, it's a beautiful man for sure. Yeah, and and his poems are just ridiculous. He's one of my favorite poets. And Ross, Ross is my colleague at IU, so we play basketball together and talk about poems. And he gardens and I don't, and it's really an incredible thing to have friends, because Terrence is another friend of mine. Like, I have friends whose work continues to inspire me. You know what I mean? In fact, Ada is another one of my friends.
Ada is incredible. Ada's
and I love Stephanie's poetry and her prose and criticism. There's a great, I think it was in the New York Times Magazine piece from Stephanie about Terrence a few years ago. That's just fantastic. But I'm glad that you were exposed to all of those writers, because I had the other version of that experience where I had 18th century British poetry that put me off of it completely. But if they had shown me William Blake and showed me William Blake's illustrations, like these sort of poetry graphic novels, I would have been much more interested. I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we are gifted this work. Hearing Terrence or hearing Ada or Nikki Finney, hearing some poets like that who speak to the present while they're also thinking about craft and speaking to the past, versus people who are in the past and have no opportunity to be speaking to our present. It's just a different experience. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter how great somebody like Blake was. He's only going to be speaking to his time. And so a 17-year-old kid in Maine or in Indiana, like I was, isn't going to necessarily respond the same way as they might to Terrence, writing those sonnets about Trump.
I mean, and it was how nerdy Terrence is that really got me, because he has this poem called Please Please Me, where that's incredibly personal, and there's violence and terrible stuff going on. But James Brown's Please Please Me is implied sonic background to the poem. It keeps weaving back in. And as someone who grew up on James Brown, and exposing my kid to James Brown, James Brown is always present in my world. Yeah. I could hear it as I was reading. It was a real experience.
Yeah. Did you watch that Get On Up, that Chadwick Boseman biopic about James Brown?
I did a little bit of it. There are some things where the artist is too close to me and I can't do it. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. I didn't watch it until I was working on a piece about him after he died, for a similar reason. I mean, he was great. He did a fantastic job. He didn't see. I don't know if it was whose choice it was, but he didn't sing. It wasn't like Jamie Foxx doing Ray Charles or something like that. Right. He didn't sing, but he did all the dancing, and that was just unbelievable to see, the physicality of that movement. And also how much, as a fan of James Brown, but also somebody who grew up listening to and watching Prince, how much of Prince's sort of grab bag of dance moves is coming from James Brown. And also some of the stuff he did with his band and his music too, right? There's this great.
He's a complicated legacy, which is why I think people I was worried about the movie, because I was there's ways you can paint this. I've made jokes in the past that biopics are, triumph tragedy, triumph again, or like, you know, that there's like an arc to it where they want this stuff to be, you know, sexy in how bad it is, and they're gonna pick the James Brown like riding around on coke kind of stuff.
Right.
Like, I hope they do James Brown preventing riots after King dies. Like, you know, that's
Yeah.
shit
Yeah.
going on.
Well, there's, you know, I ran into a lot of that when I was working on The Big Smoke, talking about Jack Johnson, you know,
Right.
trying to figure out how much, you know, my own enthusiasm and fascination with this really brilliant boxer and very complicated person. You know, like how do you balance those two things? How do you balance the brilliance of someone on stage or in the ring or on the page or whatever
Right.
with who they might be? I mean, they might be trash human beings in the world. And so how do we
Right.
balance those two things? How is it even possible that an awful person can make something beautiful? Like, how does that work? And so I think Terrence he's got another poem called When Neighbors Fight that's about
Right.
Miles Davis that sort of examines that very question. I think there's a line, and I'm going to butcher it because I haven't read it in a little bit, but he says something like, "It hurts to know the music is more beautiful than the man," or something like that,
Right.
where he's trying to navigate as a fan of the music, how you deal with this guy who used to beat Cicely Tyson. And so, you know, the same thing happens with James Brown. I mean, and it's also interesting that even the people we're talking about, they're all people who were complicit in domestic violence, you know.
Totally.
Jack Johnson,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, you know, at some point in the middle of trying to write that book, I had to make some choices, and I decided to let him live the life he lived. You know, instead of doing the thing where I instead of making a biopic, I thought, well, let me just let this man represent himself the way he lived, so that domestic violence is in it, and with that unapologetically. And
Yeah,
it's also,
we
you know, it's in the movie. Though, I'm sorry, I meant to say that it's in the Chadwick Boseman movie too.
well, and it's
They
in the
get
Great
into
White Hope, that with, you know,
yeah,
James,
I've got.
James Earl Jones. There is domestic violence scenes there.
Yeah, I have a whole lot of feelings about that movie. It's you know, I mean, Jack Johnson was James Earl Jones is great. Jane Alexander played his wife, and she was fantastic.
Yep.
But they did exactly what you're talking about. They took this, like, the most salacious moment of this man's life and turned it into a thing, instead of you know, what I hope they're going to do in this HBO mini series about him that's supposed to be coming out. Anyway, I know we didn't come on to talk about Jack Johnson, but you know,
There is a Jack Johnson section. There is a Jack Johnson section. I can get to that, but the because yeah, I would say you of all the books and I basically started going through the National Book Award finalists for poetry and just kind of knocking off whatever books felt interesting to me, which honestly, not a bad system.
yeah.
I did pretty well for myself.
Yeah.
But not a lot of clunkers making that finalist list. So I when I got to Maps of Stars, it was just immediately my favorite. It was just because it was so beautifully dedicated to the environment, and unpretentiously so. It's, as you said, when you come up in school, you get like Shakespeare sonnets, you get, you know, Keats and Yeats and stuff like that, and really dramatic old school white guy stuff, right? Where like the only place they could express their feelings was in this art, right? And they were just like doing it. And I remember who is the first poet that you fell in love with on the page? The first poet you read that you were like, shit, that's different. I could do a different.
Yeah, you know, Langston Hughes. I think I first read The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I mean, and I'd had that kind of course of you know, European canonical study. You know what I mean? Like reading Shakespeare and reading Robert Frost is another big one that they used to push in school. But when I was in high school and we were supposed to have a poetry unit, our teacher just was like, these knuckleheads aren't gonna care about poetry. So she had us bring in song lyrics, and we talked about the song lyrics instead of poems. And you know, that seemed great to me at the time because I didn't know what poetry was. And so I brought in Public Enemy. Somebody else brought, this was, 1988, I think. I brought in something, maybe Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos. That used to be one of my favorite songs. Something like that. And somebody else brought in George Michael. Somebody else brought in Guns N' Roses.
That's cool.
This is like the time. Yeah. And so she ended up choosing George Michael for our whole class to talk about some song called Monkey.
Yep.
And I think about that, like, I think because I teach a class about rap music and poetry, and I think about that all the time. Like, her idea wasn't wrong. It was just executed in a way that left a lot of people with no knowledge about poetry. Like, we could have looked at those song lyrics and then flipped it and looked at Robert Hayden or looked at Gwendolyn Brooks or even Yeats, who is almost it was like 70 years before this, has a great musicality to it. And that's something that you can teach somebody if you use one to the next, right? Here's music, it's got this beat behind it, and it makes the words sound in a particular way. Here's poetry, the words make the beat in poetry. So like trying to figure out how to share those kind of contrasting concepts with juniors in high school, it's hard, but it's not impossible. And so she did half of the work and left the rest of us kind of to do it on the other part of it on our own.
Yeah, and it's a lot of the best work I did, critical thinking, understanding like literature and stuff, was outside of school, was just me doing the work myself. Yeah. I've always disliked Ferlinghetti. I've always thought like, you're not as deep as you think you are, kind of thing. But I recently picked up a collection when I was visiting relatives, and I was just caught up in how fun the middle of the poems were. Like the crazy things that he puts together in crazy ways. And I was like, no, this is like a Michael Bay movie. This is fun. Just enjoy it. He's really fun with these words. Not everybody is on the same thing, doing the same thing. So
yeah, I think that's probably the most important thing to come to contemporary poetry with, right? I mean, we have our own proclivities as readers. Poets have their own a set of fascinations and things that they're obsessed with, but not everybody has the same mission, right? Like the agenda for Ross's poems are different from the agenda of Lucille Clifton's poems, even if sometimes they overlap, right?
Yep.
And then the patterns of musicality or the structures in Lawrence Ferlinghetti's poems might have the same idea as Terence Hayes's poems, but they work with a different kind of music and a different kind of geography, right? So trying to figure out what the poem is like and what the poet is trying to offer us, I think is almost more important than what we want, right? I think we come to it as consumers, really, like looking for the thing that we want, and that's good. Like Yusef Komunyakaa always brings what I'm looking for in his poems. I've got his new and selected sitting on my desk. I can't wait. Rita Dove's got a new book that I'm so excited to read. They always bring the heat,
Yeah.
And I know when I come into it, it's going to be something that I'm interested in because they have a similar set of values and fascinations. They both value music. They both value clarity, but also a depth of illusion and a depth of reference that some other poets aren't interested in, right?
Yeah.
And so I know what I'm going to get, but then there are other poets who I wouldn't want to write in any kind of quadrant like they write. Like I don't want the page to look like that. I don't want the sounds to sound like that, but I like what they do. And I'm interested in it when I get to it. It's just not what I want to do as a writer. And so trying to figure out how to learn from all of it, I think is, it's pretty key. It sounds like that's what you were doing too.
I always describe writers like that as like the character in the fighting video game that you do not want to be, but do not want to fight against. Their style is so unorthodox that you're just like, I don't want to be near that. What is he's wearing a hockey mask and there's just spice here. What is going on? But yeah, so that's fair. It's was wild to me that the answer to your question was the same as mine. I didn't like poetry until I read Langston Hughes. I always thought it was overstuffed, kind of full of itself. There were all these layers to it, right? And like kind of going back to Greek stuff where poets were honestly over revered. And Langston Hughes, the first poem I ever read was just him being like, white people need to stop fucking with jazz. Leave me alone. And it was like,
yeah.
He said that. Like, and it was direct and there was nothing left on the floor. There was no bullshit to it.
Yeah.
Like, he was I was like, man, that's keeping it real. Like, he was doing it.
Yeah, like that, I love that kind of poet, you know. I mean, it makes sense that you would have found him, and it was a big part of. I mean, big part of why I responded to him is because I understood him, and then I also understood him. You know, like he's talking about a cultural experience that I had some kind of understanding of, in addition to just the understanding of that language and the sonics of it. You know, he's so important, and I don't think people really talk about him as much as they should anymore. Only because there are so many poets who have come along since then and they don't get enough time, right? There are so many brilliant poets, and we're only talking about American poets, right?
Yeah.
You know, there's so many.
The one that I discovered, I'm sorry to cut you off. We're talking about non-American poets. I actually discovered my favorite poet of all time in this 2017 class, Gibson Faye LeBlanc. Thank you very much. It was Milosh.
Oh yeah.
Peace love, Milosh. And I remember my sister is a poet. She went to Brandeis. She studied under Franz Wright. She knows all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I hit her up and was like, Milosh, like this is like how I want to be in a literary space, right? Emotional, vulnerable, but like strong, you know, like there's a strength and a vulnerability happening at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're gonna have to make some decisions about who you want to be in the world if you get stuck during bombings in World War II. You know what I mean? Like, if you're gonna be able to make it to the other side of that, you got to make some choices. And I'm trying to think of what it was called. The Winter Bells, I think, is what the book is called. I might have the title wrong because it's been a little bit, but it's the book he wrote about, you know, being in the middle of this kind of conflict, this war, and World War II, and it's just stunning. Like poem after poem is just a backbreaker, and to, you know, to imagine that he carried that career forward. You know,
and translated everybody else's stuff. All the great Polish poets, he was like translating them into English and putting their stuff out. And there's a female poet that he did that with. I can't remember her name. It's like Vladislav, and she's amazing. But yeah, I got to fall in love with a lot of different voices. And if you're an informed poetry reader, to your point, when Ross Gay's putting on a new book of poems, you don't go, I hope you're not talking about, you know, gardening again. You're like, I can't wait for you to talk about gardening again. You're next level with that shit. You know, like stay with your strengths, be you. And that's how the beautiful differences are, right? The ocean everybody else.
Everybody should read Ross's new book, Beholding. It's a book-length poem that's about that move, a very famous Dr. J move when he goes up and under the basket.
Oh, the basket. The
whole book is about that. I mean, a lot of other things come into it, but it's incredible. And it came out, I think, in 2019. It was 2020 because it was in the middle of the pandemic. And so he wasn't able to kind of be in the world with it, but it's a fantastic book. It's one of the best books I've read in a long time. And it intersects with some of those things that his previous books think about too, because that's what he's invested in. But it's just this long movement and meditation on that somehow it's completely about that basketball move and not about basketball at all. Like that's
amazing.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible thing.
So, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's it.
I'm just very excited. You're the only person I can ask this to. I've written a lot of stuff. Okay, I've written, short stories, plays, essays, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I've always deeply admired poetry books because I think it's a bit of a suicide mission. Writing a poetry book feels like from the outside as suicide mission. And I'll give you my pitch. You tell me if I got a point here or not. But as a short story writer,
Mhm.
I know the beats of my story, right? I open strong, I build the world, I take my time, I hit the apex, the arc, right? And I
Mhm.
wrap it up. I know every page doesn't have to hit. I can have some pages that are just building too.
Right.
When you've got a poetry book, every poem is so distinctly emotional that, like, a lot of people can't make it all the way through a Dennis Smith book,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like a
It's,
lot of it's a lot. There's a
yeah.
lot in every single piece. And so you do 85 pages of that. You go from like, bye, mom, to heartbreak, and you're like, oh, it's the reader, keeping the reader along with you in the journey seems like that would be an incredible challenge to me. How do you
Yeah.
feel?
Yeah, well, it is hard, and I think that a lot of people don't read poetry the way it's supposed to be read. It's supposed to be like you just described. You read a poem and you think about it for a while, and then you move on to the next poem and think about it for a while and
Right.
process it. And they'll either just plow through or they'll skip pages. And so I mentioned Rita Dove earlier, and she had this book called Thomas and Beulah that won the Pulitzer Prize. I don't know, 1987, maybe, somewhere in the 80s. And the beginning of it has this kind of statement from the poet, and she says, you're going to read this from the beginning to the end. And she's basically like, don't fuck around, don't skip around in this thing. You read it front to back like I wrote it, because
Right.
otherwise you're going to miss the point. And I just thought that was so wonderful.
That's awesome.
Every book of poetry should have like instructions that come with it, like those
I love
IKEA
that.
instructions that have illustrations and things like that, because part of it is simply taking the time. Just because it's short doesn't mean that it doesn't. I mean, it in fact requires more concentration than fiction does a lot of the time. So, Edgar Allan Poe, father of the modern short story,
Right.
said that every short story should be able to be read in a sitting. And at his time, that was around 30 to 35 pages, because they didn't have a radio, didn't have electricity. So you just sit there. Maybe that's how long it took for a candle to burn out. I don't know. But
Right.
it was, like around 30 pages or so. That's the length of a short story. The modern attention span, I think, asks for a short story that's more like 12 to 15 pages. And so when we think about how differently we process and synthesize, text and language in a poem, it was hard back then when they had nothing else distracting them. So
Right.
we got all of this stuff demanding our attention, things pinging and blinking when I'm trying to read this poem. And so you
Right.
really have to focus in to get everything that it's supposed to be, that the poet's trying to give you. And so it can be exhausting to write a book of poems, but I don't think I've ever set out to write one. I've written a series of poems and then I realized that I was writing toward a book, if that distinction makes any sense.
That makes sense. Yeah, like there's likely a turning point where you're understanding this is a collection that is guided by something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. So we're talking about, in terms of music, Travis Scott, Blood Orange, Future, Young Thug, Radiohead, all quoted in the book. But
Yeah.
also that's not the extent of what you do. There's also like playing trumpet, guitar. The life cycle of music is a part of the book, right?
Yeah.
The actual touches, feels, and everything of doing music. Why did that happen, and why did that become such an important part of this book?
It wasn't willful. I sat down and started writing, and I used to be a DJ on the radio, and I used to DJ parties and things like that when I was younger. And so I got my DJ set out because we thought we had like 2 weeks. We were going to be locked up for 2 weeks, we hadn't made sure we had enough food and provisions for that 2 weeks. And we just kicked it, like had just an absolute party that first couple of weeks of the pandemic. My mom was safe. My friends were all like, everybody seemed to be okay. So we thought it was going to be just like this pause button for a couple of weeks. So I had my DJ sit out and we were doing all this stuff, but then it continued and continued and continued, and people weren't doing the things that they needed to do. At least here in Indiana, they weren't. And and so it just kept dragging on and on. And I didn't want to DJ anymore, but I'd listened to music every day. Right. And so at some point, I started responding to the music I was writing, trying to get some of the language out, because we'd sit out on our porch. So I live in Indianapolis, right? And it's loud. It's a city, and when we'd sit out on our porch, and it was absolutely quiet. There were no planes, there were no cars, there were just, birds going nuts because they had all this space. People weren't walking around even. Yeah, it was just so quiet. And so that quiet, I think, led me to start reimagining on some level what sound is, how sound is a language, how language is a sound, how music is a combination of those two ideas. And I tried to synthesize that a little bit inside of the experience of just sitting there being quiet and terrified of what this virus was doing. And so there was like this natural, for me anyway, like intersection between music and anxiety, and music and hopefulness, and music and loneliness, and all of these things, because there's a song for all of it, right? Yep. There's a song for any feeling that you have. And separate from the construction of the two things, separate from the idea of what we want from poetry or from music. The big difference for me has always been that music is occasionless and poetry is occasional. And what I mean is that there's a kind of music for any occasion, and there's a kind of poem that can speak to any occasion, but it doesn't mean you want to be dealing with it in that occasion, right? Like there are poems that talk about parties and they're great, but I don't want to necessarily read that poem at the party that's being discussed. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I want to hear the music at the party. I want to hear the music while I'm bumping down the block, but I don't want to hear, as much as I love any poet, I don't want to hear them while I'm driving to the function. You know what I mean? It's not what poetry is for me or for hardly anybody. So I was trying to mash those two things up because I had nowhere to go. Like all of a sudden there was no occasion. It was just every day was another day where I was trying not to get sick.
And as writing, like that's the strange part about the process of writing is there's just always music, right? If you're writing, and that's honestly the reason why I started Freemusicempire was I started to realize, I'm like, shit, that book wouldn't have gotten made without the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, or that book wouldn't have gotten made without Brother Ali. Like I just needed this music to get me through. So it seems like you just kind of pulled that inside the world.
Yeah. Well, it's I mean, some of it I think was nostalgia, like I think I said to you before we started, I was hanging out with my buddy this weekend, and I, we went to college together back in the 90s, and we were talking about Nirvana and how neither of us would tolerate Nirvana back then, in part because we were both hip hop heads, but also because at Indiana University, there's a road that runs along the south end of the university, and back then it was all fraternities and sororities. And if you walk down that, every single fraternity and sorority was playing Nevermind, and then eventually they mixed in Pearl Jam's 10, and eventually they mixed in Soundgarden, Bad Motorfinger, or whatever. And so those three, like Seattle, I should have started by saying my friend Kevin lives in Seattle, so we were in Seattle talking about this long ago grunge movement. But now, like I went back and listened to Nevermind during the pandemic, and I was like, this is a beast, man. I let the idea that this was a popular album distract me from the fact that it was a significant text. You know what I mean? Yep. And so that really didn't happen that much with rap music, though. Ready to Die was Ready to Die. And, in part because rap music was never as popular even at its most popular, it was never as popular as Nevermind was.
Right.
Uh,
That's
and
true.
so like, there's not an album, maybe The Chronic or one of Eminem's albums, but I can't imagine an album that got the kind of run from a rapper that Smells Like Teen Spirit got. But going back into those spaces was really nostalgic, but it also I was trying to use the time wisely. It was clear that I wasn't going to, use the pandemic to work on my French lessons or use the pandemic to become better at yoga. That's not what was happening. I was eating pizza for breakfast and donuts and listening to music, So I didn't want this to be a book that was just about that, though. I didn't want to come out with a text that was only for like music files. We're like, oh, there he goes. He just shouted out A Tribe Called Quest in that song. Like in that poem. I didn't want that. I wanted it to be a book of poetry that also had this background music, it's a little bit of a soundtrack.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, this is, I noticed in like reading a lot of people's poetry that a lot of the big name poets had embraced long poems, right?
Mm-hmm.
20, 30 page poems, because a poem changes. When you go that distance, it becomes a whole different experience. And the thing about this that I really enjoyed, Somebody Else Sold the World, is that it's the total opposite. It's cut into pieces, but the pieces come together. And so it has multiple threads running through it in different ways, right?
Thanks for that.
And so the gun poems are critically important. And they are offset in mood and tone by the gymnopedes, kind of like walking through the environment pieces. And so you have all these threads running and they all link, but it's really slick and concise, and I enjoy it.
Oh, thanks, man. Thanks for reading it too. I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's a lot.
Yep.
I was, when I did the book launch I guess last month, it feels like it was a long time ago, but last month we did it at this place called the Jazz Kitchen here in Indianapolis. And it was, in person. And I read with a couple of friends, Mitchell Douglas and Chantel Massey. And there were a couple of poems that I tried to read, and I just started to sort of fall apart while I was trying to read them, because it's just difficult in a different way than maybe some of the stuff from Map to the Stars was. Map to the Stars was really difficult to write, but I was also writing about 1988, I was writing about 1982 and being hungry a very long time ago, and how if you are poor, you don't ever really get out of being poor. Like it follows you around for your whole life. Like the habits you learn in poverty doesn't make any difference what my bank account says. I always am afraid that I'm going to use my debit card and it's going to get turned down. Doesn't matter if I just looked at my bank balance. It's still just built in, because I saw it happen to my mom so many times. You know what I mean? So even though she's working 16 hours a day and budgeting and trying to make this happen, there's always that tenuousness. And, and I don't want that, so I carry that around. So that's one kind of difficult. It's another kind of difficult entirely when I wrote almost this whole book between March and October of 2020. So it was right then. And so I'm sitting there reading this poem that feels like as if I'd just experienced it a couple of weeks ago. The great poet Adrian Rich said that if you are revising a poem, you're basically reliving it. You have to re-see that experience. And I think the same thing is true when you're reading a poem. Like if you come in there and put your foot in that poem, if you put your back into it, then you're experiencing that again. And it is hard sometimes, and other times it's a great joy. It just happens to be there are a few poems about my daughter and about my father passing in this book that are just, I can't read them right now. Hopefully with some distance, I'll be able to.
And that was the twisted world of the performance poetry, was like, if you're doing it right, you're going to want to bawl your eyes out on stage, right? Like the twisted deal is you're going to have to kind of like hold that back a little bit. So, but you want them to know you're feeling it.
Yeah.
Give them some of it, but like not do it. It's like, it's really intense.
Yeah. And you get, and because you're being scored and that there's a series of things that audiences respond to sometimes, like, I mean, in healthy spaces, it's a little bit different, I suppose, but it can become a really complicated and like re-triggering space, if and it's not anybody's fault, it's just the framework. And so poems aren't supposed to be easy, and they're not supposed to necessarily make us feel better, but they can be easy, and they can make us feel better. And so I hoped, at least in some small way, that there was a balance in the book, that there was, I'm sitting here looking at it like it's going to answer my questions, but it's like, I hope that there was a balance in the book somehow, that there were poems that were, pronounced in their anxiety and their anguish, and then other poems that were like, hey, I mean, because the other part of this is that this is I don't even think I've ever said this directly. It's a book, it's a divorce book. I mean, I got divorced a while back, and I was thinking about that experience while I was writing the poems. And so what happens when you have one kind of life and then you move into a different one? Like, I'm an old dude, I'm not out here getting traded from one team to the other. I'm way too old for that stuff. I'd have to be a general manager or an owner at that point, So imagining what the world is like today, or not today, but when I came out of that marriage, what the world was like romantically versus what it was when I started that, like what it was like in the early 2000s before you had like Tinder. Like, I've never used it, but it informs a lot of the way that people interact in the world, or social media at all. I didn't have any of that stuff when I was there. So it's all part of the world and the discourse when I came back out of it. So some of that's in the book too, like I'm out here blinking and rubbing my eyes, trying to figure out, like, all right, what has changed? What's it like?
No, and marriage is such an insane thing. Like me, my wife, like, when we'll joke around and be like, you'd be fine if I wasn't around or whatever. Like, my wife has said, hey, if it doesn't work out, I'm just going to tend to my family and be there for my family. I'm not even going to worry about it. Like, there is no like another chapter of my romantic life. I'll just be here. And that's the kind of, mentality that we have. It's, and it's for younger people. I've talked to younger people, and they're like, their headspace is in a very different place romantically, of like, does this person deserve me, and this kind of thing, right? And it's generationally different when you are older and just trying to live in the world after.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it all, I mean, I hate to say it in a way, because it makes me feel like I'm, like I'm bragging or something, and I'm not. I mean, I was very lucky that things worked out, and I was able to find somebody who could, like see all this. And so, but so there's that, maybe not that part of, but there's some romanticism that happens in the book, and I'm hoping that like that is a ballast to all the drama. We would have these protests downtown after George Floyd and all that, and they show up in the book. And one of the challenges for me, I think, and for a lot of people, was to figure out how to manage holding space for yourself, holding space for art, holding space for protest, and all of these things inside of this big umbrella of government mismanagement. And we don't know how to, this is not really a thing for the president to do. This is a thing for the states to figure out on their own. So every state has got some kind of cockeyed idea about how you're
Right.
supposed to deal with coronavirus, right? And so
Right.
all of
Don't
this,
worry, Texas will figure it out. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you see what I mean?
Right.
Like as their governor has COVID, and he's telling them that trying to sue so that people can't wear masks even if they want to. Just insane to me that this
Right.
exists, and there are so many really progressive, badass people in Houston, in Texas. I was thinking about some of my friends in Houston, but like just across Texas,
Right.
trying to get this done. But the state, just like the state of Indiana, is so gerrymandered that those voices aren't going to be heard.
Yeah.
It's just incredible to me. So I was thinking about all of that while we're marching downtown. And these are a few days after there had been some pretty aggressive protests with some rocks and bricks, and they boarded up all of the shop windows. But in Indianapolis, when they went to send the police out to protect things, they went and protected a couple of monuments, but they had this huge, I don't even know if it's a battalion. I keep starting to say a medallion, a battalion of police officers in front of Whole Foods.
Right.
Like that's the place where they chose to make their stand. And like, of all things, that's what you're going to protect. You're going to protect the store owned by at that time the wealthiest man on the planet.
Right. Right.
That's what you're going to do. And so so there's this thing where our priorities and our ideologies never lined up. There was never a time where I felt like we were consistently worried enough about the people who couldn't take care of themselves.
Great way to say it. So and to your point about all the themes running concurrently through the book, do you consider Someone Else of the World a romantic book?
I think parts of it are, because I consider myself a pretty romantic person. I mean, romantic like in the grand tradition of like I see things and get hearts for eyes and and fall in love really easily. You know what I mean? And which is, I think, an undervalued trait in poets. I think a lot of poets are like that, and they've been talked out of it, right?
That's a good point.
I've tried to hold on to it as best as I could, and tried to share that with my students too. Like, look, be joyful. It's easy because I have these brilliant students who are wanting to write about flowers, and they want to.
I mean, I get very excited helping people edit. I just really love helping people get to where they want to get to. So it's interesting. One of the first things I said to my co-host on State of the Game about like one of the things I think people don't understand about being a creative person is that art is embarrassing.
Oh yeah.
It's embarrassing to do. It's embarrassing to ingest. It's something that logic dictates wouldn't happen, right? Like, this person's going to actually go on stage in front of thousands of people and make fun of their wife for an hour. That doesn't make sense. Like, logic wouldn't, but there's when you get past that, you're able to do amazing things. When you can push past the embarrassment of creativity and vulnerability and all of that, it's a real gift. So, and I think the argument for this book is romantic. Is one I will take from the special features of the Carlitos Way DVD. They were talking, the screenwriter was talking about how Carlitos Way is a great romance. And he said, because there's tragedy and there's loss. And romance doesn't just mean kissing, it means like to put your heart and soul in something and almost kiss. And there's a lot of that in Somebody Else Sold the World. There's a lot, like the Young Lovers poem, where it's about the lovers in love, but it's about how much of the world they're missing that is like dying around them. It's funny because I really nobody ever really asked this, but that's one of my favorite poems in the book. And it wasn't a book. It was I didn't really
unlike other books, this had such a short runway that I didn't have a lot of time to share the poems with journals or have it
Right.
considered for publication. But that was the one that I was so excited about, and I'd hoped other people would
Great
be
one.
too. That was sort of a last minute thing. But I mean, not the poem itself, but trying to figure out how to have it in the world. And also was inspired by the Talking Heads,
Right.
which is always is a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm such a fan. But there was something that you said about when you were talking about Carlito's Way. I was trying to remember what the lead actress's name is. I guess everybody's an actor.
Oh, the redhead. She's so excellent.
Yeah, and because I can remember everybody else. I remember John Leguizamo being in it, and Al Pacino and everybody in it. But I can't remember her name, but I can absolutely remember how much she informed that movie. It's just been a long time since
Penelope Ann Miller.
Penelope Ann Miller, yeah. How she became sort of the most important thing in the movie. And that's something that I'm I love, and then I'm also really acutely aware of how that operates in text. We talked about the Big Smoke briefly, but I always thought that the voices of the women and their stories in the book are actually what drive that book. And so when I'm finishing up a graphic novel that's kind of the second half of that project.
That's awesome.
Yeah, they'll be out next year. And it's one of the things that I had to be really conscious of was, because it's a different format, it's a different kind of story, was, I wanted Etta to be, for those that don't know the story, Etta is Jack Johnson's wife. I wanted Etta to be really at the center of things. And so I was going round and around with the illustrator about how we could make that more, almost always, how do we have her more here? Because, I guess for somebody, it's an interesting story to hear about two boxers boxing, but to me, it's a much more interesting story to think about how that's affecting the people around them and how those people are affecting them than the actual fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's no it's hard to explain to people how important your significant other is for you as a creator, right? Like one of the guys I talked to, I mean, honestly, one of the best rappers of 2021, this guy named Def C from Chicago. And he was like, shout out to wives helping people edit. It was just run that shit by your wife, and the wife tells you don't give up on it. Next year it's your favorite thing you released. So that's a part of everybody's story, right? Jack Johnson's story. That's a part of that. You won't be there without the people around you.
The idea that we have these kind of solitary geniuses in the world, just blowing it up by their sheer determination and brilliance is it's just false. And I think it leads a particular kind of someone who maybe it can lead to a kind of disconnect between individuals and community, because I think that they're the most important thing. I mean, everybody who's played basketball has played ball with that person, who's playing hero ball from the minute they step on the court. And it's just like, all right, you don't understand. A lot of the times you're not even the best that dude's not even the best player out there. So if you're going to try to be that as a creative person, man, it is just me sitting in my office or sitting and on the porch or wherever I might be writing a poem. It's just me in that moment. But even in that moment when it's just me sitting there, Terrence is with me and Emily Dickinson is with me and Lucille Clifton's with me and my teacher Allison Joseph. They're all there while I'm working. Just because they're not sitting on the porch with me doesn't mean that they're not there in the poems. And so to imagine that somehow, I wrote this. Well, it's kind of true, but it's not really. We wrote this, but I happen to be the one with my name on it. And so anybody who's going to tell me anything different from that, I'm not interested in it. And so I know that's in rap music, for example. I know how important it is to to seem like you're the one doing this. Like Jay-Z made an entire career of this. Like it's me,
Totally.
it's Hove. Hove did that, so you don't have to go through that. You know what I mean? It's him, even though we know he has this whole team.
And the amazing part is, who was it? He would take these moments and shout specifically out team members.
Yeah.
I think there was like the end song on Rock La Familia is just him going beat by beat, like, you didn't even have a seat on your bicycle. Now you're the head of Black music. Like,
Yeah.
him he could directly acknowledge his people so that no one could say he didn't, because he knew people weren't listening to him on that deeper level. They only heard what you talked about selling ice to the Eskimos. Like, they were like, they love those bars, but they weren't listening to, Kareem, Biggs, and all these important people around.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about, I got to see Rakim a few years ago. It's probably 2018. He came breezing through Indianapolis, and the show was supposed to start at 9:30, and he showed up at like midnight.
Yeah.
And they said that he just, like, one of the people who worked there said he just got out of the limo and walked right up to the stage and just went right to work, and killed it for a couple of hours until we had to shut it down because of like the laws in the city about like closing time. And it was fantastic. He was incredible. But even as we're talking about this stuff, I think about rappers like that. I think about Rakim and Big Daddy Kane, and like that era of Curtis Blow, even like way before that, like that era of rapper, and how they were like these lone wolf rappers. Just out there, just doing this work. And undoubtedly there were all these people around them supporting them, but on the records, if they might shout out their neighborhood, might shout out some kind of crew, but there's not a collaborative shout out. You push forward, and they're all, it's a combination of things now. I think people are like, yeah, this is me rapping, but I also got my boy over here. I always thought that Gucci Mane was really good at that. And I couldn't figure out whether he was good at it because the people he was shouting out were also on his record labels, and he's like lifting them up to line his pockets, or if it's just, maybe he's like this true community citizen. He's got this great book, The Autobiography of Gucci Mane, man. It is fantastic. And he talks all about it, about his addiction, about trap and fighting with Jeezy. He calls Jeezy, he said Jeezy was an informant. Like he does all this stuff in his autobiography. It's a fantastic. I gotta read that, man. Yeah, and I mean, it's just well written. That's the other part of it. It sounds like him, in the same way that Miles Davis's autobiography sounded like him. I love those kinds of
underrated.
Books.
It's underrated.
But it all goes back to the idea of community. I mean, I have a very long list of people in the back of my book that helped me. Some of them helped me when I was 22, and I still think about that while I'm getting stuff done today. Some of them were helping me this past year, looking at these poems and trying to figure out how to make them better, but there are also people who helped me that got left out. And then later on, I was like, oh man, I should have thanked that person. And it always happens. There's always somebody who I didn't mention, no matter how long the list is.
Oh yeah.
And so one of these days I'm going to get better at it. I'm going to keep better notes, because I'm thinking of this broadly. So you took that, you taught that class for me that day. So that allowed me to do this other thing. I'm thinking about how broadly and how, the minutia of help and the minutia of community, man. It's totally. All of it matters.
Yeah. No, you have there's a poem that you have that lives in my head. Like, it's not even the lines, it's the actual scene that lives in my head. And it is from Map the Stars that is behind you. And it's where you're playing basketball and there's someone sitting behind off to the side, just yelling racist things to themselves as you're playing basketball.
Yeah.
And I just remember, I was like, that's so fucking real.
Yeah.
Just who is that guy? What is, and it was unlike anything anybody else was doing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that, man. Yeah, that was, I don't, don't write a lot from autobiography, which is going to sound weird since we were just talking about how close this new book is.
Right.
Right. But I hadn't previously, but Map to the Stars was that attempt. And that event, that experience that you're talking about, I mean, I carried that around with me for 35 years, just trying to figure out what to do with it.
Right.
There's another poem in there, another that happens to be a basketball poem, where there's this cat eating a moth in the bleachers while we're playing basketball. And I adopted that cat. So like all of it was true. And I had this vision of this little kitten sitting there watching my buddy and I play one-on-one full court, because we were in high school and had that kind of energy, and just watching us from one side to the other like a tennis match or something. And then he wandered off into this field. I mean, this is Indiana, so there are all these big cornfields behind where we're playing ball. He wandered off into this field and comes back with this moth like the same size as he was, and started just chewing on it like he'd gone to the concession stand or something. And then and we stopped for a second. I was like, man, that kitten is hungry. I mean, it's eating a moth. That can't be good for it. It's like, why don't we go get him a hamburger? And so we tried to go get him a hamburger, but Hardee's was closed. So I just took him home with me. Like this was like that whole thing. I carried that. It was like 1988. And I carried that with me for 20 something years before it became a poem. There are so many things that happen to us in the moment, and when it's happened, you just don't know what it is. Like I keep coming back to this thing. I keep coming back to, being on the train and it turning the corner and I can see the Chicago skyline. Like I keep coming back to that moment, and then eventually it makes sense and it means something to you that it couldn't possibly mean in the moment.
And so I need to build off that. One of the questions, and I think this is pivotal for anybody who's writing, right? What number edit do you start liking a poem?
Well, I like it to start out with, and I start disliking it. So it's the opposite for me. Like I love it when I first write it, and then I start to pick it apart during the editorial process. And then hopefully after 11 or 12 drafts, I've gotten to a place where I'm satisfied with it again.
Right.
But I like the poems the most, no question, in the first draft. And then it's like driving a car off the lot, man. As soon as I get done with that first draft, the second draft is like dropped in value significantly. I'm just not interested in it anymore.
So it's like, getting, when you're first writing it and looking it over, it's like the poem getting nominated for the Supreme Court, and then then it has to stand in front of the committee, and get analyzed.
Well, hopefully my poem wasn't doing up to some of the shenanigans of some
No.
but it's like, that's that thing. It's once you see it the next day, it should look different once the veneer of creation has been removed. And so I try to revise quickly and in like an intense period, like a week or two, and then I put the poem away and don't look at it again for a few months. And so then I'll go back and take it out so I can look at it again and really see it. Like Adrian Rich, like I was mentioning before about reading, right? And that really see it and revisit it from like without the flush of having written a new poem, because everybody gets hyped when they write a new poem. I had a time when I did a writer's retreat in Texas, in Marfa, for the Lannan Foundation, who was, shout out to them, and they do so much great work for especially indigenous and writers of color, just really incredible. But I was writing these poems and I knew I was throwing heat. And I was like, man, I am writing some incredible stuff. It was the beginning of Map to the Stars. That's what I was writing.
Right.
And I was like, I'm writing this is amazing. And then I went, which is not ordinarily how I feel about things. And so I rolled I did a radio show there, and I rolled into the radio station and read those drafts. and they were horrible. And while I was reading it, as I was reading it, I was like, my God, these are bad. And this is the only stuff I brought. So I was trying to like edit while I was reading, trying to figure out some way to save
Oh,
this thing. And it was just,
oh,
but it was, it was,
what a
I felt
painful
bad.
situation.
It was like, but I played myself because I know better. Like I know better. And so, but I did it anyway because maybe I was a little bit, I was feeling myself
Right.
in some kind of way because I had for the first time, like, in years, uninterrupted writing time. So I was just writing every day and I was writing most of the day. And so I was feeling like what I was producing was good. When
Right.
in fact, I think I might have just gotten into my own head.
Right.
And
You
I
were in a
think,
zone and you were like, you were in the zone making it, but you have to step out of the zone to edit. Right.
yeah, exactly.
Um,
That's
and so
exactly
I definitely have hit the stage, started it,
it.
and realized this poem stinks. Like after the first stanza, and been like,
Yeah.
oh, and the crowd knew from the first word. I'm like, oh, yeah.
This
So that,
you've got a poet that's not too far from you, Major Jackson. He teaches in Vermont,
yes, I've seen this.
Um,
Yeah.
and I saw him read one time, and he was reading a poem from, I think it was from his second or third book, Hoops. I think it was his second book, and he was reading this part of it, and he just stopped after he read it. It's like a very long poem, and he stopped after this section, and it was like, oh man, that was really bad. I'm sorry. And and it's like, I've done that when I've given a bad reading. Like when
Right.
I,
Yeah.
like I was like, hey, let me read that poem again. The poem deserves more. But he was talking about the actual stanzas that he had just
Right.
read.
Right.
And
No,
it cracked
that's
me up. It also was like, wow, that's
hard.
great.
That's
Like
good. Yeah.
I love that you're holding yourself to that standard, even though the book is already out in the world.
As a dedication to truth, right there.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so we have hit the Jack Johnson section. It's
Yeah.
time. Now,
Yeah.
when I found out that you wrote The Big Smoke, it was almost ridiculous. I was like, I already love the writing. Now this person is interested in Jack Johnson the way I am, because in 2013,
Mhm.
I wrote a paper called The Systematic Effect of Jack Johnson. This was another shout out to Leroy Rowe, USM,
Mhm.
incredible teacher, civil rights teacher, fearless,
Mhm.
showing
Mhm.
showing little white teenagers lynching pictures and making them take it in,
Oh
uh,
man.
and they yell at him after class, and he's like, "Yeah, this is you're gonna have to know this,"
Yeah.
um,
You
it's
can't
just
walk away from it.
yeah, and so I was so my wife got me into the class because she knew I was a civil rights nerd anyway, right?
Mhm.
So she puts me in there, and I finally got to write my piece on Jack Johnson. And one of the things in researching that was just incredible was like, because people talk about Jack London a lot when they talk
Oh,
about Jack Johnson. He's like,
yeah.
because the quotables that he did, but ultimately Jack Johnson doesn't really matter.
Mm.
Um,
Talking about Jack
but
London?
Jack London,
Yeah, yeah.
yep. But Teddy Roosevelt does. So President Teddy Roosevelt was a frequent and articulate contributor of editorial opinion to like the New York Times.
Yeah.
He was a sportsman. He took great interest in boxing.
Mhm.
After Jack Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion, he said, in addition, the last contest provoked a very unfortunate display of race antagonism. I sincerely trust that public sentiment will be aroused and will make itself felt so effectively as to guarantee that this is the last prize fight to take place in the United States.
Mhm.
And it would be an admirable thing if some method could be devised to stop the exhibition of the moving pictures thereof.
Oh yeah, man. He didn't want he the only thing that, I mean, he loved boxing, but he hated Jack Johnson. And so, his first move was, okay, so none of the great white hopes can beat this dude, but let's just get rid of boxing. I
Straight up.
mean, that's like, just let's do it. And so, everybody's hero, Teddy Roosevelt, also was a racist. I mean, and that's the facts of these things. And it's important. I mean, it's important as people, looking back, but also dealing with this stuff in a different version right now. I mean, we just had a racist for a president. And so
Right.
like looking backward and also looking, in the present, it's both personal and intellectual and also systemic, especially back then. It was baked into the system in a way that, made it was legal to be racist. It was illegal to be discriminatory. It was legal to not let Black people eat in the restaurant because they were Black, right? I mean,
Right.
Mike Pence tried to pull a stunt like that here in Indiana and make it possible to, to refuse service to gay and lesbian couples. Like he tried to do that, and it was like 3 or 4 years ago. And so like this kind of bigotry exists still. And so I think one of the gifts of Jack Johnson's story is that it is historic even as it's timeless.
Absolutely.
The things that were happening to him when I was working on The Big Smoke was when Obama was president, and all of the just awful stuff that got thrown that man's way. There's a poem, it's in I wrote it back then about Obama, but it ended up in the graphic novel because it didn't fit in the Big Smoke. But there's a poem, I wrote a poem with Jack Johnson giving Obama advice. And back when like he was, still thinking that he could be the great, reconciliar or whatever, like he could be, there'd be this sort of reconciliation between the Republicans who had just very directly said, man, we're trying to get this dude to be one term. We're just going to say no to everything he tries to do. And Obama, being Obama, was like, yo, I'm really charming and I'm smart and you should follow me even though you don't like that I'm Black. And, and it just that was never going to work.
No. And I would say the people really should kind of dig into those weird old Teddy Roosevelt editorials because to your point, I think people think of racism as Trump now, like that it has that face on it. But Teddy Roosevelt was racist, but he was an incredibly honest person. He hated corruption. In the same article, he talks about the corruption in boxing, how it needs to get weeded out. He went on safaris to Africa and genuinely explored his feelings on how he felt Africa was, and he was wrong and he was ignorant, but he wanted to know more. If that makes sense, he was
he's curious at least,
actively searching to learn more and be better. So there's different kind of hues of racism, right? along the rainbow, the racist rainbow. And that's important to note. And Jack Johnson is I think one of like I came up with this weird question, and it is going to be asked to you. But like so you have a lot of people now because of what's happened in Ferguson, because of what's happened recently, like Breonna Taylor, who are for the first time very active in conversations of race, right? And they don't know the history of it. So if one of these people came up to you and said, give me 5 American lives to study that will give me an understanding of the history of the racial bias in this country, who would it be? And the first 3 names that come to my mind was Jack Johnson, Geronimo, and Malcolm X.
Yeah, I think those 3 would be really good. I don't know if I think somebody has. I feel horrible that I don't know this, but I'm imagining that somebody has written something extensive about Harriet Tubman. I know there's a really great book by Quraish Ali Lansana that's called They Shall Run. It's a book of poems about her. And I'm also thinking that there must be some biographies about her. In fact, I'm gonna make a note because I want to read one myself. And then Miles Davis would be somebody else that I would think of. And it's not really a life, but the parting the waters. That I think it's a 2-book set about the civil rights movement. I think that's got. It goes forward, goes backward and forward with its work. And there's not a lot about her, but Phyllis Wheatley is somebody else I
Right.
think who's got an extraordinary life to revisit. And then, there needs to be somebody like contemporary, like Richard Pryor, or more contemporary, somebody who's had a different perspective on things than maybe some of the
Yeah, I
people
was thinking Nina
talking about.
Simone might make that 5.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just get, we're talking, there's a very long list of people that I think would be worth spending time with, at least to get a perspective on the Black experience or Black or brown experience. But I'm also, that leaves out Cesar Chavez. It leaves
Oh
out,
yeah, that's fair.
a whole community of the Latinx experience, or the Asian American experience, and how that would look. It would be a very linear thing. It would just be black and white. But I think the thing about it is that this, even for black people, the experience is so varied, and then there are these few constants, like Henry Louis Gates with the cop in Cambridge trying to arrest him while he's going into his house. So not even Henry Louis Gates Jr. it can escape this. There's this great photograph of Miles Davis with, a not so great experience of him having gotten hit over the head with a club, and his head's bleeding, and he's holding this like handkerchief on his head,
right,
while these cops are arresting him, underneath the marquee that says, like, "Tonight Live, Miles Davis." There are these things like that where it's just, it doesn't really matter what your position in the world is, because when you're in the United States, you're still just black. And so Baldwin left, Dexter Gordon left, Nina Simone left, like so many people left this country because they knew no matter what happened. Even the people who pushed hard, like the
right. Chester Himes left and became famous. Yeah.
I was thinking of W.E.B. Du Bois. He ended up like in Ghana, like, Black Panthers ended up there. Like, there's so many people who were trying to fight for a kind of thing here, and the environment made it impossible or exhausting. I feel pretty lucky. I've dealt with a lot of that kind of stuff in my life, and I've also been, I've had great points of privilege, and so it's a thing where I think about it quite a bit. But I have thought for years about leaving the United States. I like it here. I'm grateful for the things that we were afforded, but I would love to live someplace just once where I didn't feel like the government was actively working against me.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like actively, not enacting my best interest. Like, there's no, if you're taking money away from education and from healthcare to buy more bullets, that's not in my best interest. It just simply isn't. And it makes everything around me worse. And so, but not that, like, Canada is the paragon of, equality, but they do have a really incredible healthcare system. So that's one up on us.
My greatest political hope is death. Honestly, it's just that the median age of all the decision makers who are doing this bad stuff is like 82. And so they can't keep living forever, right?
even if it was just 62 instead of 82. And who knows what it would be like if it was 42.
Right. Like, they're gonna have to find new people eventually. New people will be there.
Like, one of my oldest friends wanted to be the first Black president, and so he didn't do anything. Like, he didn't go to parties, he didn't drink, he didn't do. Even when he was legal age, he didn't do anything. He just straight and narrow knocked out his undergraduate degree, went to law school. He was going to be the first Black president. And somewhere when he was in law school, he was just like, I don't know if I want to practice law, and that maybe that's not the way to do it. So he didn't finish and went and became a real estate agent, and was just balling out selling real estate. And then Obama was elected. He's like, see, he's like, I would have never gotten elected, but look what happened to the guy who did.
Straight up. Yeah, that's fair.
And back then he used to tease me all the time, because he's like, you being who you are, you writing poems and doing all the kind of stuff you do is enough for me to have to explain in my past. if I'm going to be president, you know. So I think about this stuff a lot. I mean, the people who were young and who might have had some grand ideas were coming up in a time where you would be held to such an impossible standard that only like 3 or 4 people, almost all of whom had money so they could cover things up, were able to become politicians. Now that's not exactly the case, but it's definitely like the moral litmus test doesn't exist anymore. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the representatives we have right now.
Yeah.
You know, and so things shifted somewhere, and instead of getting better when they like rolled back those ethical expectations, it got significantly worse, you know.
Yeah, no, it's not even just like it's hard to be president. Like it's hard to be in a good movie, because if you're in a good movie, let's call it Selma, right? And you're nominated for an Academy Award, the competing studio will put tons of money into hit pieces about how you didn't treat President Johnson nicely enough.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, and it'll work somehow. It'll work. It'll take shape and be like, President Johnson was such a nice guy. Everybody liked him.
That's it's well, I mean, it's language, right? It's language. Right. It's the way that it is deployed, and you know, I mean, I don't want to go Orwellian on it, but because 1984 doesn't imagine a space where there are two propaganda networks competing with each other, right? It doesn't imagine that it's just one. It's just like this one uniform thing. And so imagining a place where you have 2 people who, you know, the gym I work out at and always has Fox News and CNN on at the same time. And the things that they're showing, they'll be showing the exact same thing, but with different tags on them. One will be like, you know, well, with Trump especially, they're very different, you know. But the one will, you know, have this sort of sanitized version of what's happening, and the other one will have a really, not necessarily aggressive, but certainly more direct version of things. So one was saying, you know, Joe Biden's exit from Afghanistan is a disaster. And the other one saying, you know, Biden suggests that there are ways to do this thing differently. Like, you know, they're just, it's like I'm picturing the rhetoric, but you know, one of them is always actively attacking a thing, and the other one is defending it. And which one is which just depends on what the thing is.
Yeah, I've always said that insults are just compliments flipped on their head, right? You could be assertive, or you could be an a-hole, or it's just how you look at, you know, how the person doing it.
Yeah. Oh, hey, Daniel, I just realized, man, I'm going to have to go in a little bit because I have another meeting. Because go ahead.
One last Jack Johnson thing. I wanted to say an underrated critical moment Jack Johnson in Race in America, right? It's after his career, but he calls Joe Louis and he says, Joe, I've noticed something, okay? A weakness in how you fight. I can help you with it. Bring me in to your corner. Joe Louis's camp says, we don't want anything to do with you. White people hate you. You are the most hated. I'm the most liked by white people. I want you nowhere near me. That critical flaw was that he dropped his guard when he was about to punch. Max Schmeling saw that. And that's what Max Schmeling beat Joe Louis with in the first match. And so there's this incredible meeting point of like the guy in Joe Louis who really, he was kind of the first athlete white America rooted for. And the one that the most hated, and the lack of ability for community, right? Because he could have learned, he could have maybe even gotten better, but he didn't have the ability to.
Yeah. So, there's, I mean, he definitely was, he was well received. I think, I mean, Jesse Owens was in, I think 36.
Oh yeah.
So he would have been there, but it's all the same thing. And when you're talking about that experience, and there's another part to that story. And what it is that, that pissed Jack Johnson off. Like, he's like, you're going to tell him, like, you're not going to let me do this work and help your fighter. That's cool. So he bet a ton of money on Max Schmeling and won. So then he's in Harlem with all this money that he won on Max Schmeling, beating this new great black champion. And he's like, champagne on me, I won a lot of money betting for a winner today, and nobody would drink with them. And he couldn't understand why they were so resistant to him. And so like not reading the room in any way, you know what I mean? And that's sort of the story of the second part of Jack Johnson's life, is in the first half, he changed the world. And in the second half, the world changed and he stayed the same. And so he had a really hard time trying to understand how to manage that. And the other part of this, before we wrap up, is about Joe Louis. Joe Louis, fought Schmeling, did all, boxed throughout World War II, and donated all the money he earned at that time to the war effort. And so the practice at that time was, when celebrities would donate their time or donate money to the war effort, then the IRS would forgive the taxes on that income because, they're helping the war effort. And Joe Louis was the only one they didn't do that for.
Right. And he had to fight long after he was good just to pay it back. Yeah.
Years. I mean, he ended up, working in Vegas as a greeter, and he was just deep in debt to the IRS most of his life. And so it's like one of those things that, there's the kind of blatant, Jack London racism, like we talked about Roosevelt racism. And then there's this other kind of systemic stuff, like the IRS being like, all right, all you white athletes and, comedians and musicians, you all get excused from your taxes, but the black dude, he's still got to pay. Even though he has no money because he's donating all of his money to us to help, fight fascism, or however they framed the war in World War II. It is absolutely part of the history of this country. And it's like we were talking about earlier, though. I mean, it's I'm so grateful to have been able to grow up here. I just can imagine a version of this that would be better.
Agreed. Now, before you go out, just the last thing, and this is an interesting question for you. What is it that you do better in your writing now than you did in 2019? What do you do better on paper?
I hope everything. I spent a lot of time. 2020 was a little bit like woodshedding. I spent a lot of time thinking about language and a lot of time reading books, and obviously I wrote a lot. But I think that I'm just better at being honest in the poems than I was before, and certainly better at writing about the present, because I have never really done that. So like writing in real time is a brand new experience for me. Even the other book that I tried to send you, but I wasn't able to get that PDF. It's in real time too. So like trying to figure out how to be, maybe that's part of it, how to be present in writing instead of always looking backward.
And I did get a chance to read the Maggot Brain poem that you had in there, because I attended a class taught by Hanif Abdurraqib. Read it. I'm a big Hanif guy, so I was really and your stuff came on, and I was like in the chat, like, my favorite poet in the world.
Hanif wrote a blurb for that book. I like him so much. Just like as a human being, he's my dude. But then, just as a writer, that guy is incredible. Anyway, I am so glad we got to talk. I'm sorry that I have to edit it. It's the last 2 days before classes start, so everybody wants to meet.
It's understandable. I would say concision is what separates this book from the others.
Oh, okay. I like that.
The ability to impact in a major way, like you said with Young Lovers, that's not a long poem.
No,
it's hugely impactful, and it lives with you. And to be able to get more done in less space is something that it feels like you've been working on and doing a great job at. So.
I appreciate you saying that, man. If I could write a poem that, like my ideal poem is only a page long.
Right.
And I've been trying to figure out how how to make that the limit. Like that's the amount of space I have is just that one page. There's a book called Talking Dirty to the Gods by Yusuf Komunyakaa, and he gave himself the assignment, or he was in the space, whatever, I'm not sure how the form came about, but he writes in 16, every poem is 16 lines with four line stanzas.
Wow.
And this is coming off of him writing a poem that's half of a book. You know what I mean? And these other poems are 3 or 4 pages long, and like he's writing long form and then flips and starts writing these shorter poems, and they're fantastic.
That is, love it.
And so sometimes I think it's easy to forget that, like with the way that poems sprawl, a lot of my favorite poets are just like, they go on. I'm thinking about Ross now. He had one of his poems. It might be that the fig tree at I think Third and Christian is the title. Where he goes in, he's like, and he talks about it, he's like, yeah, and I know I go on too long. Inside of the poem, he's saying that kind of stuff, Like I love that so much. And that's sort of the opposite of me, because I don't go on. I try not to go on.
Right.
I try, and I try to not be conversational. I try to have a line that seems more like Robert Hayden than Frank O'Hara.
Right.
Like I try to think about the poem that's more like Gwendolyn Brooks than it is Allen Ginsberg.
Right. No, that makes sense. It's that's awesome. And I was thinking of Black Boy Heaven when you were talking about the sprawling and how like that poem becomes several poems and really comes out of the other side.
Like some people, people can do it, and they're brilliant at it. I'm not, because I'm not, this is a different form, obviously, but on the page, I'm just not chatty. It's just not, it's not, I can't find the music in that approach. Like my friends can, like, I love how they do it. I just can't, like music expects for me, like the music of poetry expects for me, expects a kind of a tightness. I don't know what other, like things have to be really taut for me to make the kind of music I want to. Awesome. So anyway, it's so good to talk to you, brother.
Keep exploring your style to the fullest. I appreciate you. Thank you for everything.
Fun. Hey, so hit me up later and let me know if you need anything else. All right, man.
I'm good. Thank you so much.
All right. Hey, thanks for talking to me.